All right, welcome back to this episode of the Fray Podcast. My name is Austin Gregory, and I'm your host. And this week we are continuing our series going through the book of Daniel, and we're just going through it bit by bit. But the purpose of this series is, one, to help me get back into teaching the Bible, because it's been a minute because I'm not a youth pastor anymore. And I'm in this season of transition. So this is just a way for me to kind of work out that muscle before I dive into something really big and challenging for me. Also, it's to give you a resource to go through the Bible and to really dive into the content of specifically the book of Daniel and how it can relate to your life, how it can give us a framework for how to live faithfully in a world that is not always for you. And so this week we are diving into Daniel chapter 2. We're not going to cover the entire chapter. We're just going to cover a section of it that I believe will be helpful for you. And so my main goal of this episode is to help you see that the gifts God has given you will not always look like what you traditionally think of when you think of God calling you to a certain space in this world, or that He's given you some gift for you to use to build His kingdom. It's not always going to look like the way you think. I think a lot of times what we imagine is God's going to give us a gift that is traditionally Christian or godly, in the sense of you will become a pastor, you'll become a preacher, you'll become an evangelist or a missionary. But God doesn't always use you in that way. Some people are called to those areas, but then some people are not. Some people are gifted in very crucial, important ways that are not going to be delivering a sermon every Sunday, but instead are going to be out in the world building the kingdom in ways that may look worldly to some people, but are actually vital to the kingdom of God. And so I want to look at Daniel because I think Daniel's story really hammers us home. We're going to start off with a text breakdown. And if you don't know what that is, it means we're just going to break down the text bit by bit. I don't believe that you have to do verse by verse. Maybe that'll be a hot take series, episodes in that series one day. But essentially, the first thing I want us to notice is in Daniel chapter 2, also I'm going to be reading of the CSB version, just so you know, we come into contact with King Neb in the second year of his reign, and he's been having dreams. And it says in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So my man's stressing out. He's bugging out, right? These dreams that he keeps having over and over and over again are troubling him to the point he can't get a good night's rest. And so he does what a king does, right? Especially in Babylon. He asks the interpreters to interpret his dream. Now, the problem is King Neb has had a dream, and he's not going to go about getting it interpreted the way he usually does. It seems like he's noticed some problems, right? And this dream is way too important to just be made known to just any and everybody. Instead, he wants the people interpreting his dream to not just interpret it after they, hear his dream from his own lips, but he wants them to come, tell him the dream he had, and then interpret it. That raises the bar. It raises the bar because the interpreters are now having to do something that they cannot within themselves do. And so this gets into part of the world solution. So for the world solution, what I mean by that is the interpreters who are existing in this world that Daniel lives in the realm of Babylon, the world solution will be based on the Chaldeans, the mediums, the sorcerers, the magicians that King Neb is asking to interpret the dream. And so with that, there's two things I want you to notice. Is the world's solution to King Neb's problem, right? And to add on to this about King Neb's problem, it's not that he just raised the bar for how you're going to interpret this dream. He also gave dire consequences if you don't. So if everyone fails to interpret this dream and to tell him about the dream beforehand, without him, communicating that to them, you're being executed. You're done for, right? So it's a life or death situation. Lives are on the line for how this dream will be interpreted. And initially, King Neb takes it to the Chaldeans, the magicians, the sorcerers of his kingdom. And he gives them the chance to interpret the dream. But the problem is, is one, they're limited in power. What I mean by that is the worldly interpreters lack the source of power to rise up to the occasion. They were operating within the bounds of this world, which is why they make the comment in verse 11. So in Daniel chapter 2, verse 11, it says, what the king is asking is so difficult that no one can make it known to him except the gods whose dwelling is not with mortals. That's key, right? It says no one can do what the king is asking except the gods. Problem is the gods don't live amongst us. They live in another realm, in an unseen realm, and they're not going to interact with King Neb. They're not going to interact with the mere mortals, right? That's out of their nature, especially in the Babylonian theological system, right? But that's key, is to understand this relationship the Babylonians have with their gods. It's not a personal one. It's not a relational one. It's not one that they can just come to the gods and say, hey, God, I'm struggling with this in this season of my life. Can you please help me? I'm losing sleep. Instead, the gods have no desire to help King Neb with his dreams. The gods have no desire to help the magicians and the sorcerers interpret the dreams in order to save their own life. There's a lack of love there. And so the second thing is the world solution that exists amongst these magicians, these Chaldeans, is they lack purpose. The worldly interpreters wanted to interpret the dreams to save their own life and were willing to manipulate the king in order to live another day. Now, if you hear that, that is thunder. That's because it is about to storm. So I'm going to repeat that real quick. The worldly interpreters wanted to interpret the dreams to save their own life and were willing to manipulate the king in order to live another day. I'm saying this not because the text necessarily says that, because it implies that. The king seems on guard against these magicians and these sorcerers and these Chaldeans interpreting his dream, which is why he's holding back the information about what the dream is, and he wants them to find out on their own. It's because he seems to be skeptical of them actually being able to do the job at hand. Seems like he's maybe had some experiences, or he's caught on that some of this is just fluff. Some of this isn't really substantial. Substantial, maybe is the word. I'm not sure, but it lacks substance, right? What they do lacks substance. It has no real. It's hollow on the inside, right? Now this takes us to Daniel's solution. Daniel is now, if you remember from last episode, him and his friends have been blessed by God with gifts, and Daniel specifically with the ability to interpret dreams. Now, what I love about that is Daniel's ability to interpret dreams is not a godly gift. Meaning, in this context, the only people who did that were people who worshipped other gods. So this would be seen as a little bit of a taboo. But often what the things that we deem as secular, so if there's a sacred secular divide that some of us are familiar with, is, there's sacred music, which is Christian music. It's Brandon Lake, it's Maverick City music, maybe a little bit of Lecrae. Granted, Lecrae crosses the line sometimes. That would be sacred music. It's music that glorifies God in a very apparent sense. That thunder was loud. The secular, though, would be music that doesn't necessarily glorify God. It's not intended to glorify God. And so this is your Halsey. This is your Miley Cyrus. This is your Chief Keef. Whatever it is, right? There's that sacred secular divide. The problem is both groups in that situation are making music. And we've split them up into sacred secular, saying this is godly and this is not. But it lacks the understanding of where those gifts come from to begin with. And that's what Daniel is kind of, this section of Daniel is speaking to, is who gives you those gifts? Who gives you the gifts to interpret? Who gives you the gifts to interpret dreams? Where do dreams come from? Dreams come from God Almighty. And so Daniel is going to go to the source of his dream. So there's three things I want to point out about Daniel's, three things I want to point out about Daniel's solution to the king's problem. One is he rises to the occasion. So Daniel responded to the situation in verse 14. It says, with tact and discretion. So when he hears that he has the captain of the king's guard come knocking at his door, they're going to slaughter Daniel and his friends as well, because they're considered wise men. There'd be people lumped into that category for needing to have interpreted the dream. Daniel and his friends open the door, and Daniel responds with tact, means he remains calm. They're there to slit his throat, and he's remaining calm, and he acts with discretion. And so with that calmness, he's not afraid. He's not fearful of what's about to happen. Instead, he says, can you tell me the situation? Let me see if I can help. And then when he's given the information about the situation, he responds with, let me handle it. Get me into the king's quarters, and I'll tell him the dream, and I'll interpret it. So then, the second thing is Daniel depended on God, who is the giver of gifts. So verses 12 through 23 kind of show us that him and his friends, they gather around and they start asking the God of the heavens for mercy concerning this mystery. Daniel and his friends go immediately to the source of the giver of gifts. If they're going to get the job done, they got to go to the source. And so they go to the place where there's power. The other wise men, the Chaldeans and sorcerers and all them, the world's people who could answer this call, are limited in power. They don't have access to the gods like they think they do, right? But Daniel and his friends, they have direct access to God. They have direct access to the creator of those dreams and the person who is able to interpret those dreams. And so they turn to the source. The third thing is it's backed with a purpose. Daniel's given this gift not just willy-nilly, right? There's a greater purpose at hand. It's not just a job title. Instead, I want to read this. This is in verses 29, the end of verse 29 through 30. It says, the revealer of mysteries has let you know what will happen. And as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but in order that the interpretation might be made known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. So Daniel gives credit. He gives credit to God as a one who has blessed him with this interpretation and the knowledge of what the dream was to begin with. But then he also says that there's a reason why. You're not. He tells King Neb, you're not just given these dreams for, to entertain you in your sleep. You're being given these dreams because there's important information that you need to know, and we'll get into that information in the next episode about what's the contents of this dream, because it's crucial. It's important for the building of the kingdom. Now, the part I want to add on to all this is, how does this apply to your life? Right? You can read this and be like, okay, so like Daniel, he's basically operating in the secular world, but he's using his gifts that God has given him for godly purposes. Awesome. How does it apply to your life? Is I put, as people of God, we should not be operating like the world does with the same talents and gifts. We should rise to the occasion in full dependence on the God who can use you in mighty ways, and we should do so because our gifts are given to us for a purpose that is larger than ourselves. Our gifts exist for the building of the kingdom. So my question I want to pose to you after reading this section is, how has God gifted you? Right? It doesn't have to be preaching. It doesn't have to be you becoming a missionary or worship leader or anything like that. How has God gifted you? It can be as a plumber. It can be as an electrician. It can be as an artist. It can be as a musician. Whatever it is, you don't have to put a cross on it in order to do it. Instead, you rise to the occasion. You raise the bar of excellence for the field that you're in, right? You do things to your very best, to the glory of God. I think that may be Colossians 3:23. It says, I do everything I do with my hands, I do to the glory of God. Do it to the glory of God. With that, as you're going out and you're doing things to the glory of God, do it with a purpose. You're doing it to build the kingdom, to make his name known. People should look at your work and say, man, they're not just doing it to get a paycheck. They're not doing it just because they needed a career to put on their job title or their resume. No, they're doing it because there's a love for it. They see that there's a greater vision at place. What is your grander vision? Have you bought into Jesus' grander vision for the world and what is to come? When you do that, that's going to fuel you each and every day, regardless of whatever rut or season of aridity that you find yourself in. So, that is it for this episode of the Fray Podcast. Thank you for listening. As always, tune in for the next section of Daniel. We're going to dive into the dream and specifically what is the contents of the dream and how is that important for the rest of the storyline of the Bible, because it's got really big consequences. Subscribe to the podcast. We are on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify, and so you can kind of listen wherever. There's a video format, there's audio format, whatever's your preference. Thank you guys, and find us on Instagram and Facebook.